very important to us that we're now opening out the conversation, and I'm going to make a few remarks just to kick things off, really talking about the work that we've done to define ethical and effective information use, and to undertake very in-depth research in four wonderful local authorities with whom we've been working closely now as a group of academics and local authority leads and practitioners for 4.5 years to try and understand the challenges of using information in ways that are both ethical and effective. And the report that you will have links to through the chat and in other ways today is our first attempt at a summary of that learning. And very important today that we've got an opportunity to discuss it with you and share some of the core content. But I really want to emphasize the importance of the discussion. I've been in various jobs around government and wider public sector, trying to provide research and evidence to support decision making. And one of the things I've learned, I think, from 30 years of trying to do that is that, of course, policymakers want quick results. They want immediate action on entrenched and long-term problems. And part of the challenge of this is that these things take a long time. So we're very lucky to have 5 years of funding from the Nuffield Foundation, really to work through in depth some of what the challenges are and what the opportunities are around ethical and effective information use. So we've learned a lot in our 4 sites, working with sites, and I think sites would agree, the local authority colleagues, they've learned a lot too. And we're going to share just some summary of that. But we also now want to, in the final 6 months of the project, think more about the materials and resources we'll produce and how those will help others learn from the work that we've done, but also to map or draw together examples of related practice across the country. And that's really a primary reason why we've brought you all together today, is to hear from your experience as well. So I just want to emphasize that the importance of, I hope you will share your experience and understanding of what ethical and effective information use means to you, and how you're thinking about doing it or planning to do it, because we need to work out how to garner that information and synthesize it for government and for each other and for ourselves, so that we can really help develop this field move forward. And I suppose I need to emphasize that point. That was one of the key messages from the work in the 4 local authorities, is that information use has become widespread, mainstream, a broad commitment of governments and chief execs to information use in many ways. But actually, what information is and how it's used, I would say this as an academic, but these are difficult issues, and we really need to establish a field as a set of practices and skills and requirements. And we need to support people to have the time and understanding to be able to do information use in ways that are ethical and effective. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. If I could go to my next slide, please, Chris. In working across the 4 authorities, it's really important to say that we co-produce this work with the authorities. This wasn't a traditional research project. We set off with a clear end goal. It was very important that we were working with the local authorities to understand how information was important to them and what they prioritized in terms of trying to use information better. And so we worked with them on bringing research techniques and analytical techniques to addressing issues that were important to them as they sought to understand their communities and work with their communities and with their practitioners. So at the center of this circle is what we've summarized in terms of a definition of ethical and effective information use. And these 4 elements are all, I think, really important. So firstly, integrating voice, essential to ethical practice and indeed democratic practice, that we are hearing and responding to the voices and concerns of communities, of children in this particular case, but also of families, and indeed of practitioners whose voices tend to not get heard in issues about how policies are made or information is used. So integrating voice is essential. Related to that is understanding needs. That a lot of policy is made on the basis of simplistic or even erroneous understanding of what the needs of communities are. And a lot of what local authorities are trying to do is to understand the needs of their communities so that they can appropriately respond to them. But how does information really help us understand needs? A lot of work has gone on there and is required there. So those are more maybe perhaps on the ethical side. More on the effective side is the importance of appropriate action. It does follow from an ethical approach that information is used for its intended purposes and achieves the objectives that are set for it. We talk a lot about how information can be used to improve lives, experiences, and outcomes, but actually doing that is very difficult. That's the core challenge. That information has to be integrated into decision making in a meaningful way. And a lot of the work in the sites has been about trying to establish ways of doing that. So appropriate action, very important. And then also best use of information, by which we mean that really to understand needs and integrate voice, we need to go beyond just use of averages on national data sets and indicators and KPIs, and use a much broader base of information that might be available in information systems, in case files, in meetings, and in other ways. How do we really integrate an understanding of needs and integrate voice into the information that is made available to support decision making at strategic or operational levels? We have to be very mindful about using all the available information in the appropriate ways and going beyond, as I say, national data sets and simple averages to understand needs and understand experiences and understand how services and supports can best enable people to thrive. So there's a sort of definition that has been worked through, co-produced with the foresights. And then round the second tier of the circle, the 8 boxes, are 8 activities that we found ourselves doing in order to achieve those purposes set out in the centre. And in the report, I hope colleagues will read the report, we provide examples in each of the foresights of each of those 8 activities. And there isn't time to discuss them all now. I might highlight that 3 of them are about voice. So bringing voice into the co-design of information systems, that's in a way voice about information use. Integrating children and families' voices into information use, that should say at aggregate or strategic level. So how is decision making for the authority as a whole shaped by an understanding of the views of children, families, and practitioners and others? And then also improving voice in operational information use. That is to say, at the level of individual practice, how is voice integrated there? So 3 aspects that are about voice, but also some really important challenges around how information gets fed into to support decision making. So using theory of change, it's not new, of course, but in this project we've used theory of change to understand information use and how information can be used to support appropriate decision making. There's a lot of learning from that. I'll give you another example: mapping information, understanding the flows of information so that we can make best use of available information. So we could go round the circle and discuss in more depth the 8, but we don't want to spend the whole of the meeting describing what we've come up with by way of this framework. But I just want to emphasize that in the discussion, when we go into the breakout groups, you might have examples of any one of these 8 things or different combinations of them, or you might define ethical and effective information use in other ways, and that's all fine. We don't claim to have invented the sole truth here. We're trying to test out a model, and it's really helpful to hear other views. So, for example, if anybody's used theory of change to think about information use, for example, but there are other parts to this. I just want to say a couple more things. Secondly, round the outside of the circle, infrastructure and governance and behaviours and culture, obviously essential to the implementation of improvements to information use. And research and practice are leading on work to help us think about how the learning materials resulting from this project can enable those 8 activities and enable the achievement of ethical and effective information use, but through an understanding of the challenges around the outer rim of the circle there in terms of issues of infrastructure, of governance, and of course behaviours and culture. It is a complicated business, but we've tried to summarise it in that one infographic. Now, I'm just going to take a couple more minutes to talk briefly about the work in 2 of the sites, Oldham and Rochdale, to give an example, and then I'll ask Lisa to comment on the work in Hampshire and North Yorkshire, the other 2 sites. We haven't asked the site leads to present today because we're very wary of burden on our local authority colleagues, and the purpose today is to have a broader conversation, but I do hope colleagues involved in the work in sites will comment as you see fit, and indeed in the breakout groups. So just briefly to summarise the 4.5 years of work in Oldham and Rochdale. These are 2 boroughs within the Greater Manchester Authority area who are each committed to improving early years experiences, particularly of the most disadvantaged children in their communities. And both have participated in the project from a starting point of the challenge: how do we define and indeed measure the outcome of that? The standard terminology is to think about school readiness, and indeed there's a national metric, a national ambition, based on the good level of development as the indicator based on the foundation stage, national indicator assessed by teachers of child development at age 5, and there's a target for all authorities based on the national mission that all children should achieve that good level of development, and that we need a 7 percentage point increase in the proportion of children that are achieving based on the good level of development indicator of the early years foundation stage. That is a national mission announced by the Prime Minister. But what does that actually mean in the reality of a local authority trying to achieve what is a very substantial increase in the supposed real development of children at age 5 through a set of early years services? And in both Oldham and Rochdale, we have been hugely impressed by the work that is going on to try to implement the policies of family hubs and Better Start and so on, Best Start in Life, to achieve that objective, but also really trying to use information to support the achievement of that objective. And that is in the frame of those policies. But the learning, I would say, from those 2 authorities is that information is required in lots of different ways, really, to achieve that objective. How do we really understand needs? How do we really understand the outcome that authorities are trying to achieve? The work in Rochdale is working with a community there to understand how parents and carers define and understand school readiness. What is important to them in the achievement of it? What are the barriers in the achievement of it? And how does that information help shape a set of services and supports that might meet the needs of parents? Work in Oldham has focused on speech, language and communication, and the challenge of both understanding needs, where there are a set of tools, the ELIM and Welcome, that provide an indication of early communication skills difficulties, but without much understanding of the family context. And in engagement with practitioners, led by practitioners, really, the work in Oldham has focused on how do they work with parents and carers to get a richer understanding of the challenges for children in the development of communication skills, to understand the home learning environment, to understand the context, and how is that information absorbed into existing information systems. And lastly, I just mentioned some of the work we've done in Oldham and Rochdale around actually trying to understand that system, the mapping of the system for achievement of that national mission, it's a very large and complicated system that spans multiple institutions. And we've been trying to understand how that system works so that we can think about how information really supports the realization of that goal. And all of that needs to be written up and shared more fully, but I wanted to give a sense of the aims and ambitions of that work. Lisa, can I bring you in there, please, to talk about Hampshire and North Yorkshire? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Leon. Good to see you all. And good to have an opportunity to try and relay and share with you the information of the work that we've been doing with Hampshire and North Yorkshire, which are our two local authorities where we're focusing on children's social care and have been for the last 4.5 years. So unlike Oldham and Rochdale, where there's sort of very similar areas of practice and policy, in North Yorkshire and Hampshire, we're looking at two very different aspects of children's social care. So in North Yorkshire, we have been working and focusing on care leavers and particularly understanding what are meaningful outcomes for care leavers. We quite often talk about our work in North Yorkshire as thinking about, actually, when we talk about outcomes for care leavers, we think about the dominance of government voice, the dominance of information that is part of the statutory reporting by local authorities through to the Department for Education. And what we've done with North Yorkshire collaboratively is to take a bottom-up approach, starting with a group of young people who are care leavers and with the personal advisors, the care leaving teams, to really think about, okay, well, what would be the most meaningful set of outcomes? And rather than just saying, well, let's just completely get rid of what exists within the national data sets, what we've been looking at is what already exists within local authority case management systems in North Yorkshire. How can that information be used more effectively? Can we incorporate it? And so what we have done now is we have utilised the range of questions that form part of the pathway planning process and have incorporated those into the care leaving dashboards. And that includes both quantifiable scaling information as well as qualitative statements by the care leavers in North Yorkshire. So what we've been doing there is really looking at better uses of information as it already exists so that we can foreground the voice of care leavers more so in North Yorkshire. We do now have a series of resources where we've written up the work in North Yorkshire, and we're also working with a wider group of local authorities that are also using the signs of safety pathway plans, which is what they do in North Yorkshire, to look at the replicability of what we have been doing there. Just apologies for 1 second. Sorry. In Hampshire, we're focusing on a very different aspect of the children's social care system, and we've been focusing on early help. And so right from the outset of the project, working with Hampshire, there was a real interest and commitment to thinking about how do Hampshire support children and families and incorporate the voice of families when families are at the edge of children's social care. So those families who might need some additional support, but essentially really thinking about early help. So we've been focused on early help throughout. And we've also been trying to focus on early help, particularly with parents and children where the children are sort of in middle childhood, so not necessarily just with younger children. What we've been doing with Hampshire is identifying existing processes and procedures that can be utilised differently to bring the voice of parents into early help services, and particularly the early help hubs and the decisions and the discussions that happen once there's been a referral. And what we've done in Hampshire is we've incorporated a process of capturing voice notes, which is trying to capture the voice of parents, and using an existing process that happens as part of the referral process where there's statutory data protection mechanisms, and using those to capture the voice of parents that are then used in early help hub practice meetings. So when there are discussions about families, what we've been doing in Hampshire is bringing the voice of those families and of parents into those discussions and into those meetings. So again, two very different aspects of children's social care, but very much about trying to make sure that when there are any practice meetings or discussions, that we are bringing the voice of children and families and care leavers into that. And apologies if that wasn't entirely clear. Sorry.
Huge thanks, Lisa. I appreciate you doing this, especially today with at least a cold, and have some water. Thank you. Lots more to be said about the work in sites, and I hope there will be future opportunities to hear more. But today we really want to hear from our panel members about how this relates to wider issues, and from everybody here about how this relates to your own practices and your own thinking about children's information. So as a first go at that, I'd be delighted if you would respond to this Menti question through the QR code there, or via the code itself, or through the link in the chat. Question is, what is the most pressing issue from your perspective in relation to children's information use? We've talked about some of the things that we're concerned about, but we'd love to hear from you. When you think about this question about how children's information is used, what are the most pressing issues there? Thank you. Hopefully everybody's managing to load that up. Three big issues there. Thank you. Lots of issues, and we will capture those in the blog when we write this up as well. So thanks very much for putting those in, and it'd be interesting to see how those come out in relation to the panel discussion, which I think we should go to now. Marianne, if you agree.
Thanks very much, Leon, and I agree. A lot of interesting things in the chat there on the Mentimeter. And if you weren't able to add to the Mentimeter, please do as Rick has done and add to the chat instead, and we'll gather all of these when we get to the next part. So if we move on to the next slide, Chris, and move back into slideshow mode, that'd be great. Thank you. I'm just going to now introduce our speakers. We have a panel now, a panel discussion, and we've got three speakers who have offered, were also volunteers, to join us. And these are three people for whom the connection between data and voice is a significant focus of their everyday work. And in preparation for this session, we've asked them each to consider how the report and the framework aligns with their work, what they think the most pressing issue is, answering the question we've just asked you, and to identify the improvements they would most like to see, thinking particularly around how this project could contribute to that. So I'm just going to introduce them all in advance now, and we will then move through them as they talk for a few minutes about their views on these questions. So our first speaker is Alistair Herbert, and Alistair is the lead officer for Data to Insight, which is a local authority-led service for children's safeguarding data professionals. And those of you who are data professionals in the room probably already have a lot of contact with Data to Insight. So drawing on a career focused on children's services, he knows about data work, he knows about information systems and cross-organisation collaboration. And as well as this, he's an executive director for the local government standards organisation iStand UK, a member of several other advisory groups as well. Alistair is also the design lead for the Department for Education's current project to introduce a new Centre of Excellence for Data and Digital Work in Children's Social Care. And Alistair is going to speak first. Our second speaker is Joe Lane, who is Deputy Director of the Children's Commissioner's Office. He's a former history teacher and has worked in policy and research roles at a number of national charities, including Action for Children and Citizens Advice. And last but absolutely not least, our third speaker is Sarah Goff, and Sarah is Deputy Director of the Multi-Agency Information Sharing Programme and that run by DFE. And Sarah is leading a programme of work to improve multi-agency information sharing so practitioners can identify needs earlier and provide timely support. And this was set up in response to poor information sharing being a contributory factor to the majority of serious child safeguarding incidents. And if any of you are familiar with the reports that come from serious safeguarding incidents, you will know that information sharing is always identified as an issue there. So we have this interesting panel, and I'm going to hand over now. We'll take the slides down, and we're going to hand over now to Alistair, who's going to lead us off in his talking about the points I mentioned earlier. Over to you, Alistair.
Thanks very much. And you gave me 3 questions to prepare for this, and people who've heard me speak before will know I tend to go off on a tangent. So if I end up spending a long time talking about the first question and very little of talking about the third, it's because I've got an eye on the clock. How does this align with our work? I think there's loads of really valuable links with the work that we've been doing in D2I and across the kind of network of data professionals around the country and local authorities who are all kind of trying to improve on their work and deliver good practice locally in quite difficult circumstances. So just through from kind of having these promoting these pioneering projects in different local authorities, doing that ground level work is really, really valuable, through to kind of setting the principles and the approaches that the main report has in it around good ways of honouring children's ideas about what information use should look like, how services should use data. It's all really valuable material for us to be kind of chewing over and making sense of. As a technician, then my mind inevitably zeroes in on some kind of structural and systemic points around what this means for the way we do work. And so the stuff about information use being a formal field of practice, I think, is really crucial call out in the report for me. That I'm an English literature graduate by background 20 odd years ago, so come a long way since then. But there's lots of people with stories like mine in this field who've never had kind of formal training. There's no kind of accreditation for the kinds of people who are using information in this sector. Whether or not that needs to look like social work accreditation or something else is an open question. But the fact that there is nothing that does that for us, it really makes life difficult for local leaders, I think, social work leaders, to assure themselves their functions are appropriate, they're well staffed, and for the people working in those functions to be confident that they're doing the work that the local organisation needs. So I think that's a really key kind of thing that I'm interested to dig into further off the back of this report. And then the other thing that really resonated with me was this kind of the talking about the need to change away from reliance on current statutory data sets. And Leon covered this in quite some detail in his opening remarks, so I won't dig into it too forward. But I think it is a real big challenge, and kind of moving the needle on that is a crucial thing in getting us better at doing work in this zone. And then for me, the thing I always come back to is this kind of idea that local improvement works well when you get people empowered at the local level to do better work. And so working in this way alongside local authorities, professionals who are in those roles, helping them develop their practice as information users and analysts is really a key part of the puzzle. So not just providing the advice, the guidance, the examples, but then thinking about those theories of change and testing them in the real world. The next thing you asked me about was the most pressing issue, which is the same question on the slide here in relation to children's information use. So I think there's a key thing that directors of children's services talk to me a lot about: sharing information with other agencies. How do we use that? But then even when they've got the sharing in place, what quality is that data and how well uses it once they've got it? That's a real kind of issue. The quality of analysis I've kind of touched on. Are we doing high quality analysis? We're making good use of that information we've got. But it would be remiss of me not to talk about the thing that I think is the key risk or threat at the moment, which is not just for children's information use, but anyone's information use really, which is like unregulated artificial intelligence usage. For me, we always welcome innovation by saying it's going to free up time. And then in my experience, it typically ends up making us busier in different ways and with different things. But I think there's a kind of a conversation that hasn't matured yet about what artificial intelligence is doing in social work practice at the moment. As with almost every previous technological efficiency or enabler, we want to automate and speed up the bits that we think aren't working very well for us. What we can risk ending up doing is turning more and more of the work into automatable units. And we've seen this story play out with case management systems previously, that the case management system becomes a beast that you have to feed. And I think there's some concerning stuff there that we really need to be thinking about in quite some detail, because the agenda from the government on the practice side is that the goal of reform is to make social work more personable, make it more social. And large language models are not sociable. They synthesize and they kind of replicate and they pretend, but they're not doing that social bit of social work. And so how do we use information in those ways? What do children and families think about that? Because it's their information that we're using. That'd be the key issue for me. And then I said I would have to speed up as I got to the end of my 5 minutes. And so I'm going to do that in answer to the third question. Specific changes or improvements I'd like to see. I'd like to see the world change in such a way that analysts and information professionals in local authorities are at the top table in terms of doing strategy design, service design for social work. And I'd like to see that happen in a world where those analysts and those information professionals are worthy of being at that top table in more organisations. And I'd count myself among that number of people that have been sitting in that role, wanting to have more of a say and not quite feeling qualified to do it. So I'm not trying to throw shade at any individual working in those roles at the moment. I think we probably can do better, and it'll be a kind of a systemic effort to make that happen. Doesn't get there overnight. It's a kind of a culture change. And if there might be questions come up in the session later, thing you mentioned at the beginning, working with the DFE to do this Centre of Excellence for Data and Digital Work in Children's Social Care, that's a really key kind of tenet of that work. And the kind of stuff that's coming out in this report is really, really valuable material to help that conversation move forward. That's a bit about what I think about all that stuff. Thanks very much for giving me a chance to speak.
Thanks very much, Alistair, and some interesting points being raised there. I'm sure that all of you will have views about the use of AI or not in social work. I'll just give you a wee plug here. There's on World Social Work Week, Social Work England are doing an open access session on the use of AI in social work practice and social work education, if anybody wants to go onto the social work education website and sign up for that. Okay, so thank you, Alistair, for sharing that with us. And as I said in the chat there, we do want to have questions to ask our panelists as we go through the session. So please do think of your questions and just add them as we're going along, so that we can give the panelists something to chew over when we get to the Q&A session. And don't be afraid of giving them tricky questions to answer. I'm sure they're all very good at doing that. So I want to hand over now to Joe, and Joe's going to cover some of the same issues, but probably the very different perspective. Thank you, Joe.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm Joe from the Children's Commissioner's Office, and hopefully everybody in this room has some idea of who we are and what we do. But very, very quickly, we exist to protect and promote the rights of children. In England and in the UK, in some instances, we have some special powers to help us do that. We can visit children receiving public services, we can get ministers to respond to us, and we have data gathering powers, so we can collect data about children from public bodies, which we use very frequently, and we use to match data sets which aren't always linked together, which will become relevant later on. I guess first off, it's great to be here and like to be with so many like-minded people interested in what is quite an esoteric issue for lots of people. And I guess the offer at the top is this is one of the Children's Commissioner's sort of big areas of passion and where she wants to have a difference. She's entering her final year in term, and she wants to make sure the implementation of where this has got to in terms of policy gets as far as possible. So that's an open offer to get in touch with us and to use us and see where you think the Children's Commissioner and the Children's Commissioner's Office can be helpful. It's also a pleasure to be here because I know the work overlaps with different departments, but the Rees Centre in particular has been very formative for me personally I remember reading a lovely piece of work on the educational attainment of children who'd been SYN and EverSyn in particular, and I think which was like a very formative piece in terms of thinking about flows through the children's social care system, which often isn't done, and children in the social care system are sort of thought about as a static group. And actually, I think that's a really important perspective to approach this in terms of the importance of data and how we use children's data over the course of their lives, and thinking about how services interact with each other. I want to start the like substantive bit of what I say with a sort of a broad reflection, really, which is I think lots of this work is the sort of part of the state's attempt to answer something which we don't really know how to do at the moment, which is responding to both higher expectations of individuals and higher expectations from individuals of the state in terms of the services they receive. And I think that increases what I think I sort of refer to as domain complexity, the expectation that services work well together. And there are lots of different reactions to that. So some of that is seen in things like duties to collaborate, duties to co-commission, hubs in various different places. I think there's one paragraph of Working Together to Safeguard Children which lists about 15 different panels or co-working groups to bring together different professionals, and we're sort of searching around for how do we meet these higher expectations of individuals. We expect more people to be able to achieve and to thrive and to flourish, and that means giving them more support. And how do we meet the expectations of individuals of the state that services will work together and that they won't have to tell their story twice, etc. So this, I think, should be seen as one part of that. And it's not unique. So I in my bio mentioned that I used to work at Citizens Advice. One of the big issues at the time there was that people with debts often owe debts to lots of different people, and those people who they owe debts to didn't know about that. And that included even within local authorities. So different bits of a local authority would be collecting money from the same person without talking to each other. You know, the housing department and the, you know, like a parking fines department will be going after the same money that person didn't have. So this, you know, and this issue crops up all over the place in terms of how the state interacts with people. One of the jobs we do at the Children's Commissioner's Office is to listen to children, and I want to sort of go back to that now, which is children really expect this to be happening anyway. So they obviously not thinking about this in the same way as us, but their mind is boggled when their social worker doesn't know what their school attendance is. You know, to them, they are we are or they are the state. And crucially, their interactions with the state are only as good as their worst interaction, is our sort of common reflection we have back. So if they're at a brilliant school, but they're on a CAMHS waiting list, their interactions with the state are probably poor, and that'll be even poorer if when they get to the front of that CAMHS waiting list, that organisation knows nothing about what's been going on at school or how that school has been supporting them in the interim period. What a boy told us in a survey we did recently. We should link all the schools and clubs. They should talk to each other properly so that they can help young people. So, you know, that's a sort of reflection of they expect it to be happening, and sometimes they know it's not happening. I'm going to come to the 3 questions right at the end, and I'm going to take them in reverse order. So to get there, so the Children's Commissioner's Office perspective on this work has been hopefully really clear for the 5 years of her 6-year term so far. It was one of the first areas the Commissioner said, I want to see progress on. I want the implementation of some sort of unique identifier that supports data use and data use across services. And that was, as was said in the introduction, partly prompted by reviewing safeguarding files, partly prompted by the advocacy that we provide to individual children, the frustration that we and they feel around data use, and partly inspired by the research we do. And I guess, you know, an example off the top of my head is the educational histories of children in the youth justice estate, where a really interesting finding is a big proportion of those children in the youth justice estate come from quite a small number of educational institutions, and that data is completely hidden at the moment. And there's a really interesting national story about intervention and what's going on in those areas in particular at particular moments, understanding whether that's a sort of cohort effect or a fixed local area effect. So time and time again, probably weekly, something crops up in our research where we think better data sharing between organisations would make children's lives better. This week, we're publishing some research of a survey of almost every college in England. And one of the things that's come up really strongly is that college leaders get almost no information about starters from the school system. And that's both at an individual level, it's at an EHCP level, and it's at a system level in terms of tracking impact, tracking things like attendance between Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. So, in almost every area of children's lives, we hear, lack of data sharing between services is hampering our efforts to make services better and improve children's lives. When we did our most recent piece of work, and I'm going to skip some of the life of this, we published a piece of work called the Children's Plan, based on a survey of all schools, so the bigger version of that college's work. And one of the key findings of that was lots of children turn up at school with what we would call additional needs that are not regularly captured by the education system. So I think the best example of that is things like homelessness, living in temporary accommodation, being bereaved, having a parent in prison. And those are children who are very often experiencing severe educational difficulties, but where the school almost never knows that information about those children. It's not pulled into any interventions that those schools are doing, and actually schools and teachers end up spending lots and lots of time scrabbling around to get that data and to sort of build a clear picture of those children. So I think the where we are as an office and where the Children's Commissioner is that the sort of the use case of this is incredibly clear. And I think that's really important to remember as we sort of move into the sort of implementation moment. How do we do this better? Because I think one of the things that happens in the life cycle of delivery is, as you get into the delivery and it becomes hard, people forget the reason you started delivering it, and that those use cases become sort of weaker memories in our mind. Our view is how to do this question has been answered really clearly. So both within government, within NHS, within local authorities, and we've had a snapshot or a snippet of that today. Lots of people are doing this. It's doable. The technical challenge of, we can see children in different systems, we can identify them, we can match them. That's not the barrier. So where we are as an office is that the work really needs to go into the sort of the why we're doing this and the how we're doing it. So what does the sort of delivery of this look like? The most ambitious sort of version of it look like? And I'll sort of jump off from that into my answer to the three questions. So in terms of improvement, I'm going to take them in reverse order. I think for us as an office, the improvement in this broad area of work would be around that sort of moving beyond the argument for testing into sort of implementation and infrastructure, sort of operationalizing this. And Alistair touched on credentials, and I would see that as one part of that sort of institutionalizing element of this. How do we make this a sort of a fixture in the infrastructure of children's services development, in a way that we've done successfully with things like education, but quite poorly on things like early help. Early help is a tricky service often because it has very weak institutions, doesn't have a recognised delivery model, doesn't have a recognised profession, doesn't have, often doesn't have a fixed funding or recognised funding base either. I think the most pressing thing is to really raise the ambition. So I know lots of the approach to this is around social work and safeguarding and child protection. I think our view and our sort of work in a broad range of areas is sort of children's information and the way data is shared has the capacity to improve services in children's lives in a huge range of areas. So really stepping out of that sort of safeguarding lens and looking, it's vaccinations, it's the relationship between attendance and formal childcare and sort of early years education, and that list is incredibly long and could go on. And I think in aligning, I think there's a really important point, and especially to that first point, the institutionalization of this is really important. And I think lots of that will be the national framework, but the delivery will inevitably be local and probably hyper local as well. So I think one thing which is so important is that as this hopefully matures and progresses, that this type of work that supports both local authorities but also practitioners and frontline services, that sort of and one of my favorite books is where the state meets the street. that like who, the actual person doing the mediation between the sort of like what's the infrastructure and how am I delivering this to a family is vital. So I think that sort of framework approach, that sort of how are we actually doing this on the ground, aligns perfectly with that sort of what I think is the big improvement. How do we sort of mature this and operationalize it? And I've definitely used over 5 minutes, but super excited to get into sort of thoughts and questions.
Thanks very much, Joe. Don't apologise. It's good to hear lots of interesting ideas and discussions, and good to hear what a priority it is with the Children's Commissioner Office to think about data and data information and voice. So we're going to move on now quickly to Sarah, who's going to be our last speaker. And I see there are some questions in the chat already for Alistair, and hopefully there'll be some added for Joe as well and for Sarah as we go through this session. So thank you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, and hi everyone, my name is Sarah Goff. I'm Deputy Director here at the Department for Education. So I'll try and keep it short because I'm sure you'll all be looking for a break. But so the first question of how does the SIT report align to my work? Well, it aligns really closely with my programme of work here at the DFE, and particularly the ambition to enable safe, timely and consistent information sharing so that practitioners have the right information at the right time to safeguard and promote children's welfare. And that very much underpins our wider reforms in children's social care, which look to identify needs of children and family earlier, so they get that support they need as early as possible, and stops needs escalating and children falling through the cracks. And part of that very much is moving away from sharing information because it meets a threshold, and that more ethical and effective use of children's information, so you can really understand what life is like for a child, because we know from serious incidents that is something that's often lacking, and people have a part of the puzzle but they can't, don't have the infrastructure or to have that all together. The most important, I think, message from my perspective is that the current system is too fragmented. So that aligns very much with our sort of 2023 report to Parliament. And what that does is it means that there's variation in how information is collected, recorded, shared across agencies. It lacks that family context, and that creates sort of avoidable risk. We did emphasise within our report that we want to create more consistency in information sharing standards, better join up in services and clearer national expectations. I also very much appreciate the distinction in your report between information and data. I think that's really key to know that the two are different. In terms of what's the most pressing issue, so from my vantage point, I think it's the lack of coherence across the system, which affects safeguarding in sort of 3 main ways, and that we're trying to tackle. So practitioners do not always know what information exists, where it sits, or who's responsible for sharing it. We heard Alistair and Joe talk about that in terms of the school-specific cases, and that can lead to delay, duplication, and in some cases missed opportunities to identify harm early. Again, Alistair already said this, I think, but data quality is really variable, and it's not always recorded consistently. That makes it difficult to link information across agencies. And the third point is sort of cultural barriers still persist. So even when there's a lawful route, practitioners can be reluctant or feel they aren't able to share information, and that's something that came out really powerfully in our user research in terms of the project that we're leading, that people feel really happy when it's a Section 47 child protection case, but very much at that earlier stage, they don't know if they can and can't share, so we want to very much make that clearer for people. And then changes and improvements and how you can contribute. So I think what I'd really like to see, and the priorities I would emphasise, are we need clearer national guidance and training on lawful information sharing, so practitioners feel really confident in what they're doing. We're doing that with the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill. We're introducing the new information sharing duty, and we'll provide statutory guidance, which we're consulting on with a range of professionals to make sure that that's really clear, that you should share information. GDPR shouldn't be seen as a barrier. I think both, like Alistair and Joe have said, much more about better interoperability across education, health, police and children's social care systems. So multi-agency safeguarding arrangements are there. We made that change in 2017 very much because we emphasised the need that not one agency knows enough about a child, and you need that multi-agency perspective on safeguarding. So those 3 safeguarding partners, along with relevant agencies in their area, should really coming together, understanding the context of the children and families they're supporting, thinking about that in terms of commission support, etc. So we really want to build a better system across that. Improved governance frameworks. So we're exploring how we can do that better through our statutory guidance as well. So one of the things we're exploring is whether a template data sharing agreement, so lots of local authorities and multi-agency safeguarding partners have said that will be really helpful. And obviously we've got the role of the Centre of Excellence, which Alistair talked about earlier. And then the other area is about the sort of consistent identifiers. So Joe mentioned this. We're leading the work to introduce a single unique identifier. It's currently in the Children's Wellbeing and School Bill that introduces the provision. And how we sort of, the power in that is if every local sort of partner has a really consistent way in which they are identifying children, they can match much more reliably across their services. And for those that don't know, we're working at the moment to pilot the NHS number as the single unique identifier before we look to mandate its use via regulations at a later date. And our sort of initial piloting, we're going to definitely saw those benefits of having that single unique identifier in terms of identity management. And then sort of finally, the second part of your third question of how the SIP project can contribute. I think it's got a real opportunity to drive progress. It sets out the compelling case for change. It'll provide that practical roadmap. Really like the fact that you're working with local areas to think about real world solutions, especially around data linkage, interoperability and practitioner confidence. And I think there's a real sort of joint effort here in what we're doing at DFE in terms of our statutory guidance for the information sharing duty, how we can link together on that and adopt maybe best practices that you found, so we're not reinventing the wheel. Hopefully that was 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And we have now actually gone way past our Q&A time. So what we'll do is we'll just do some very quick Q&A, and thank you, Joe and Alistair, for already answering some of the questions in the chat. That's really helpful. So that kind of gives us a starter for 10. If I just kind of come back to you first, Sarah, can you just summarise maybe one or two key points about the learning from the pilot about the unique identifier?
Yeah, so I think the thing that we found was the sort of most beneficial thing about a unique identifier is that you need a central sort of version of the truth. So one of the reasons why we've used NHS number is because that already exists at the NHS number. You've got the personal demographic system, which holds all that personal demographic information. So you're able to link